thank you very much for coming to this. This is the second research symposium put on by the Sustainable Urban Planning Program, and it's a very exciting one. The people that are speaking today are part and parcel of what we're doing in the planning program. We approach planning as both a humanitarian and a scientific enterprise, and I think what you'll see today is both of those things put on display. We're going to start with Chris Leinberger, my colleague here at GW, who's new in the business school. The second speaker will be Jan Bruckner from UC Irvine, Economics Department. Then we'll take a coffee break. Then we'll hear from Garrett Knapp, the director of the Center for Smart Growth at the University of Maryland. And finally, my good friend Jan Song, who I've known for 10 years, I guess, right? And I consider Jan, I oftentimes describe her to my students, to other people, as the best of my generation of PhD students in planning. So it's really a top-notch group of people, and I think we'll have a nice afternoon. And then please stick around because there'll be a nice cocktail party at the end of the day. So don't miss out on that. And Chris, I'll give it to you. We need to escape. And then
minimize, and I'm down there someplace. There we go. So here, let me do that.
Go ahead.
You won't find it. Good afternoon. I'm Chris Leinberger, and I'm a professor at the real estate and director of the real estate program here at GW. It's housed at the business school. I also have a few other hats that I wear. I'm president of an organization called Locus, Latin for place. These are the major developers in this country that are engaged in transit-oriented, walkable urban development, and it's a political advocacy organization focusing on Capitol Hill, on the transportation bill, tax reform, and a variety of other things. And I have been a developer. I still maintain a limited partnership interest in my development company. And then in my prior life, I owned and ran the country's largest real estate consulting firm based in Bethesda, but with offices throughout the country, focusing on what to do with land for developers and for cities. So I come at this with a private sector perspective. And the thing is that I live here in DC, that my wife and I moved here consciously 7 years ago. We were living in Santa Fe, out in New Mexico, and could have moved really anywhere. And we picked DC because all of my research showed that Metro DC is the model by which we're building this country. 20 years ago, it would have been Atlanta, Dallas. But that model is now obsolete. And what we're doing here in DC is really the model. And so I want to describe the economic factors that are driving what is referred to as the walkable urban future of this country, as well as throughout the world. Though obviously we in this country are followers of the walkable urban trend as far as center cities go. I'll make the case that we are leading the world as far as the urbanization of the suburbs, which is a major factor in this trend that we're seeing. So first off, first we start with the fact that when you look at what we're talking about the built environment. The built environment is all of our real estate, the apartments you live in, the houses you live in, this building, and all the infrastructure that supports the real estate. The metro system, the roads, the sidewalks, the sewer, the water. Well, the built environment is a mere 35% of the assets of our economy. It's the largest asset class. And we in real estate are particularly proud of this fact that we're so big. And we can demonstrate this every few years because you've probably noticed that over the last 3 recessions, we in real estate caused 2 of them. And unfortunately, the reason that this economy is only bumping along at about 2% growth right now is because this asset class is not fully engaged. And it's my perspective that the reason this asset class is not fully engaged is because we in real estate are not giving the market what it wants because we don't know how to do it. And I'll talk more about that in just one second. So since we're talking here about the economics of sustainable planning and sustainable development, we have to go back to the underlying economic system of the age. And if you look at the industrial economy, which in this country peaked in 1970, something you may not know is that 40 to 45% of all the jobs in this economy in 1970 were related to the raw material going into the manufacturing, the sales, servicing, financing, insuring, and building the roads and fueling the automobile. So as you were seeing the USA in your Chevrolet, you were making yourself wealthier. So it only made sense that what we built was what's referred to as drivable suburban development. Drivable suburban development, which you all probably understand intimately, very low density, has an FAR, since most of you are planners, we can talk in jargon, would have an FAR of between 0.05 and 0.4. Every product type would be separate from one another, and the only way to get around is by cars and trucks. It's too low density for transit to serve. And we put in a few bus systems, but we just said, that's just for the poor. And we don't really care about the poor. And bikes don't work, and of course you can't walk, and certainly your kids can't walk to school because they get run over. So we put in this place, we put in place this drivable suburban form of development. In fact, it was invented in this country. It's been exported throughout the world. And it made us wealthier. It was a reflection of the underlying economy. So prior to the Second World War, prior to the Depression, in this country, we built primarily the other way of building the built environment, walkable urban. Walkable urban is much more dense, at least 5, probably 10 times more dense, and really works better at 20 to 40 times more dense than drivable suburban. And it's got an integrated product mix where residential and office and retail all can be developed together. And you can get to these places by many different modes of transportation. Certainly cars work, but also bicycles and transit. But once you're there, it's walkable. And so we're talking about much more compact development patterns, what we would consider to be European. Though, of course, the Europeans, they only have that kind of walkable urbanism in their center cities, in the centro, in Spain. And they have engaged in vast drivable suburban development out on the fringe. In fact, when I go to Spain, Barbara is from Spain, that when I go to Spain, I never take pictures of the great urbanism in Madrid or Barcelona. I take photographs of the big boxes out on the freeways and these 8-lane freeways. I mean, they've learned very well how to build drivable suburban. In fact, I gave a speech at the Spanish Downtown Association about 3 years ago, and it was in Malaga, which is a gorgeous town. It's really come back so nicely. But the speech was in their convention center. Their convention center is out in the middle of nowhere, across from a super regional mall. You can only get there by car. It's just, I really gave them a lot of grief for why did you put this convention out here? It made no sense. So anyway, we in this country built most of our development back in at the early part of the 20th century, late 19th century, as walkable urban. We didn't have the option to do drivable suburban. But of course, after the Second World War, we pushed the pendulum all the way over. And all we built was drivable suburban. The market wanted it, and we in real estate gave the market what it wanted. And of course, we have no shortage of land in this country because this is obviously a sprawling way of building. We basically stole the land fair and square. We have a lot of it. So we used it up and throw it away and just keep on moving out. So you know, of course, how we have been developing in this country. We first pushed the freeways out and started building single-family subdivisions out on the fringe. Then, of course, we learned how to put a commercial out here. This is one of the first regional malls outside of Philadelphia, the King of Prussia Mall. And we just got better at building freeways. And naturally, we could push our development patterns out further and further. In this country, for every 1% population growth in the late 20th century, we had 6 to 8% land use consumption. But that was then, this is now. When you look at the history of economics, it's a series of waves. There was first the agricultural economy. And the agricultural economy peaked in the early 19th century with about 92% of us working on farms. Today, it's 2%. The industrial age, again, peaking about 1970 with 45% of us directly and indirectly engaged in manufacturing. Today, anybody know what that number is? It's 9%. So 11% of us produce all the food and produce all the goods. And by the way, if you think that the US has lost its manufacturing edge, it's still the largest manufacturing power on the planet. China's right now neck and neck with us. But we have all the high value, along with Germany, all the high value manufacturing. And so 11% produce all of the stuff that we need for daily lives. What's the next wave, or the current wave, is, of course, the knowledge economy. And, you know, the software that is driving this program, it didn't get to me by truck or rail. It got to me wirelessly. It doesn't need the infrastructure that the drivable suburban world built. It's a different way of not just earning a living, but it's demanding a different way of building the built environment. And it's my sense that the next wave to hit and layer on top is the experience economy. Certainly tourism is the first example of that. It's the largest industry on the planet now. But it's far more than just tourism. And about 2/3 of tourism is urban tourism, walkable urban tourism. But a great example is the Apple Store, as far as an experience economy company. Apple gets into retailing just as Disney was getting its clock cleaned as a retailer. And here Disney is one of the great merchandisers on the planet, and they couldn't make it as a retailer. Steve Jobs says, I'm going to do it. He goes in, creates the Apple Store. In retailing, the relevant range of sales levels that you can expect is anywhere from $400 per square foot per year in sales to about $1,500 per square foot. $1,500 are for jewelry stores, very small, high-value things in very small square footages. So that's sort of the range. Apple stores, they're doing between $4,000 and $6,000 per square foot. That's comparable to, I used to pole vault, that's comparable to a pole vaulter, you know, the current world record's 21 feet. That's comparable to somebody pole vaulting 60 feet. It's just a whole nother game altogether. And that's what the experience economy, as it's beginning to unfold, most of the experience economy will be a walkable urban experience. So the experience economy is demanding a different version of how we build the built environment. And the experience economy is demanding choice of either drivable suburban or walkable urban. But my numbers show that we have vastly overbuilt drivable suburban. It's still viable. We've just built too much of it. In fact, it is the overbuilding of the drivable suburban fringe in this country is what caused the mortgage crisis, therefore is what caused the Great Recession. Where the pent-up demand is, that won't be satisfied for at least a generation, is walkable urban development, a fundamentally different way of building. So what we're seeing is that the pendulum's beginning to come back. It started somewhere in the mid-90s, as we began to see some of our downtowns turn around, and certainly downtown DC, as I mentioned, DC is the model. And downtown DC is one of the great models of a fundamental turnaround of a place that 20 years ago, you wouldn't be caught dead in downtown DC. Then again, maybe you would have been. But instead, downtown DC is 95% built out. It's almost done. And all in 20 years, this phenomenal vitality and tremendous economic development activity. So what's the reason for it? Well, I know who to blame for this trend. It's my damn students. It's the millennials. It's our kids. These are the folks driving this. Those between 18 and 34 are the age cohort that is driving it. And the best way of thinking about this is television. Hollywood does more consumer research than anybody. When those of us with gray hair were growing up, Hollywood was giving us things like Leave It to Beaver and Dick Van Dyke and the Brady Bunch, all set in a drivable suburban place. They did their research. That's what we aspired to in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We didn't all live there, but that's what we aspired to, and that's what Hollywood gave us. Today, starting in the 90s on to today, it's Seinfeld and Friends and Sex and the City and How I Met Your Mother, all set in great walkable urban places. That would not have happened in the 70s and 80s in Hollywood. In the 70s and 80s, urban settings were shown as one of my favorite programs from the 80s, Hill Street Blues, where showed this dysfunctional city that was just falling apart everywhere. That was the image of walkable urbanism in the 1980s. That's not the image today. So many other reasons, of course. There's never one reason. The baby boomers, for the millennials, this is unfortunate. The baby boomers still have a role here. That as we become empty nesters and we're beginning to retire, we see, of course, a downsizing, and many of that downsizing movement is into walkable urban places. When you add up the impact of those two generations, which are the largest two generations in the history of the country, what you're looking at is a shift in demographics. Back in the 50s and 60s, 50% of all households were singles and couples. 50% were households with children living in them. Today, 75% of all households are singles and couples. Only 25% are households with children. The target market for walkable urban development is singles and couples. Not to say that families aren't welcome, and I live near Georgetown, and my wife and I walk through Georgetown. We always know we're in Georgetown because there's this baby boom going on. And all these millennials, they tend to like these Cadillac double-wide strollers that take the entire sidewalk in Georgetown. So you have to walk in the street so that they can go down the sidewalk. So there is a baby boom going on in the Georgetowns, in the Kents, in the Upper West Sides, in the Lincoln Parks up in Chicago. So certainly families are welcome. Naturally, the schools have to be dealt with. That they are being dealt with. It's slow. But now look into the future. At the marginal increase in households over the next 20 years, only 14% of net household growth will be with households with children in them. 86% will be singles and singles and couples. The market's telling us something. The other thing is sheer boredom. Most metro areas in this country 20 years ago, if you wanted to live in a house, buy a house someplace in that metro area, you could buy a single-family house or a single-family house. Your choice. There was no choice. And boredom is a much underrated motivation for a social change. You have lots of choice when you go to the supermarkets, but how you live, you have no choice. You've probably heard a lot about Richard Florida's work in the creative class, and he's pretty well demonstrated that the knowledge workers, the creative class, those are the ones overwhelmingly demanding walkable urban places. But then finally, it's the sheer economics of it. It is the cost of maintaining cars. We in real estate always thought that the car companies were our friends, that they got our customers to the homes that we were selling them. Lo and behold, they were eating our lunch because they were absorbing the spending capacity of the households. The average household in this country spends 19% of their household income on transportation, almost all of it, for cars. If you disaggregate the data, drivable suburban households spend 25% of their household income on driving. They have to maintain a fleet of cars to participate in society. Everybody over age 16 must have a car. Walkable urban households only spend 9% of their household income on transportation. That 16% delta is nearly $1 trillion per year in annual spending. Serious money that could be used to increase your mortgage capacity. It could be used for education. It could be used for that most un-American of all activities, savings. If you drop one car out of the typical household, according to the AAA, it costs you $9,200 per year to own and maintain and fuel and park and service a car. You convert that into mortgage capacity at 4% interest, you can increase your mortgage capacity by $150,000. Generally, houses maintain or increase their value. Cars always depreciate. So you're shifting your spending into an asset class that can build household wealth. So how is this manifesting itself on the ground, or really on the roads? One of the rules of thumb, one of the things that people have taken for granted for the last 100 years is that as we've grown in gross domestic product, GDP, we have equally grown, 1-to-1, in the most common measure of how much we drive, which is vehicle miles traveled, VMT. So as GDP goes up 2% per year, vehicle miles traveled went up 2% per year until the mid-90s. For the first time in the last 100 years, those trend lines began to diverge. And the amazing thing is, in spite of a growth in population in this country of 1%, really 0.9 of 1% each year, we have now peaked in total driving. And the peak had nothing to do with the recession. In this country, driving peaked in absolute terms in 2004, when gasoline was the equivalent of $1.50. It's now down 6%. But the young people between 18 and 34, their driving peaked in 2001, and it's down 23%. On a per capita basis, it's down by 1/3. From a social science point of view, this is falling off a cliff. This is the young people saying, hey, look, I have to put a roof over my head. I want to feed myself. I have this nasty habit of liking to eat. And I have to pay off my student loans, which their parents didn't have to pay off. And you want me to pay for a car as well? I can do 3 out of 4. I can't do all 4. And many of them are saying, drop the car. So the research that I want to now lay out for you is how this trend is laid out on the ground here in Metro DC. As I say, Metro DC is the model, and I don't have time to go into why it's the model, but work I've done at Brookings and work I've done here at GW has laid this out pretty definitively. There are more walkable urban places in Metro DC than any other metro area in the country. And there's 6 types of these walkable urban places, what we're now calling walk-ups. Now, and by the way, I'm only talking about what I refer to as regionally significant places. These are places that play a role in the regional economy. These are not bedroom communities. So if you know Washington, Cleveland Park is a bedroom community. Foggy Bottom is regionally significant. They play 2 different roles in the economy. So first, of course, are downtowns. And I mentioned about downtown DC and the tremendous turnaround that it's experienced. My favorite ones are downtown adjacent places. These are places that surround the downtown, and they'll have different character than the downtown, probably lower density. Some of them will be funkier, some of them will have just a whole different feel. Foggy Bottom is a downtown adjacent place. DuPont Circle, this image, is a downtown adjacent place. Then there's urban commercial. These were, 100 years ago, they were local serving retail centers, serving their bedroom community. They all went downhill economically. They're now all coming back. And U Street is the obvious example, Adams Morgan. The fast emerging one now is, of course, H Street. But the surprising thing is that there's another three types of walkable urban places, and they're in the suburbs. And this is the surprise about Metro DC, is how much of this walkable urbanism is taking place in the suburbs. There are suburban town centers. These are 18th and 19th century towns that were absorbed by the growth of Metro Washington. So Old Town Alexandria, Bethesda, Silver Spring. These were laid out before the automobile, a great grid of streets, historic buildings, and they've now, most of them, come roaring back as walkable urban places. Then this is the biggie. This is the one that the next generation is going to spend the bulk of its time redeveloping. And this is the redevelopment of strip commercial, particularly regional malls. And we in this region have the two biggest regional mall conversions underway right now. White Flint up in Montgomery County, and the whole area around White Flint, and of course, the granddaddy of them all, Tyson's, the largest suburban concentration in the world, 44 million square feet of what's considered unmitigated hell. And as you probably know, the end of this year, 4 metro stations will open at Tyson's. They have overlay zoning to triple the density, up to 150 million square feet. And they will probably end up developing 4 or 5 separate walkable urban places that will have great economic power. And then finally, the sixth type is one that we won't see too much of. We'll see a lot of this in China. Greenfield development. This would be like National Harbor, if you know that place, or the granddaddy of greenfield developments is naturally in this region, and that's Reston Town Center. So how do they lay out on the ground? Here, of course, is downtown, and surrounding downtown are the downtown adjacent places. And here are the urban commercial places. Here are the suburban town centers. And here's all the drivable suburban strip centers that are being redeveloped into walkable urban places. And finally, the few greenfield sites. All of this activity, what we're looking at is, this is where the bulk of real estate development is going to take place over the next generation. And particularly the high end, the economically valuable real estate development will be taking place in these places. There'll be a few more added. It represents 0.91 of 1% of the total land mass of the region. It's the proverbial 1%, is where the wealth of this region will be generated. And then when you add in the local serving places, the bedroom communities that are walkable urban, in all probability, we're going to see the vast majority of real estate development in this region take place in about 10% of the existing urbanized land. We don't have to add 1 additional acre to this region to economically grow. Of course, the 80% of these walkable urban places are rail transit served. One of the things that anybody who studies urban planning knows is that transportation drives development. For the 6,000 years we've been building cities, the transportation system dictates everything else that follows. And so the expansion of Metro has been a crucial factor in this. The other thing to note is how we build our cities historically. And it's that our cities have grown in this country following a very simple formula. If you know where the white upper middle income housing concentration is, every metro area has a concentration, 60 to 90% of the white upper middle income housing concentrates in one section. Ever notice where all the country clubs are and all the high-end malls are? Then the local minority concentration, where is that? Tends to be on the other side of town. Race has always been a dominant factor in how we have built the built environment in this country in particular. And then you look at the transportation system, and over the late 20th century, it's been, of course, freeways. If you know those 3 things, you can tell where what is referred to as the favored quarter, the favored 90-degree arc coming out of downtown, where the vast majority of all job growth has gone. Here it's outlined in red, obviously going to the northwest. In Atlanta, it goes to the north. In Kansas City and Denver, it goes to the south. In Seattle, it goes to the east. Obviously, topography plays a role here because in Seattle, it's hard to go to the west unless you want to tread water a lot. So obviously, topography plays a role in where the favorite quarter goes. But in this country, every metro area has a favorite quarter. It's been our great challenge as a society, as we've seen ourselves split into two societies in each metro area. But the interesting thing here in this town, and I've not seen it anyplace else, is that just within the last 10 years, we're beginning to see the expansion of the favored quarter to the northeast and to the southeast. Capitol Riverfront, St. Elizabeth's, hopefully Capitol Heights to the southeast, and to the northeast into Prince George's County. We are seeing an expansion of private sector employment going outside of the favored quarter. This is possibly the most important social change we will witness in this generation as we begin to bring opportunity closer to where lower income people live. So let me quickly go through some numbers and wrap up. That 42% of these walkable urban places are in the District of Columbia. 58% are in the suburbs. That's the big surprise out of this study. As far as the past 3 real estate cycles, just looking at the regionally significant product that's been delivered, in the 1990s, about a quarter of all real estate development went into these walk-ups. In the 2000s real estate cycle, it was 33%, and in the cycle starting 2009, it was half. And when you add in the local serving real estate development, which I do not have those numbers, but I'm guessing that it will total about 80% of all the real estate that's been built and delivered over the last 4 years has been in walkable urban places in this market. What do you get when you have a shortage of product? You get pent-up demand. What do you get with pent-up demand? You get price premiums. This is the biggest way that we know, or the most important way that we know that there's pent-up demand for this. This is what the market wants. Walkable urban office rents now have a 75% price premium over drivable suburban. 25 years ago, Tyson's Corner was king of the hill in this market. Highest rents, highest absorption. Downtown, lowest rents, lowest absorption. Today, it's just reversed. That's why Tyson's is putting in Metro. They want to be like downtown. Same thing, of course, happens with residential, and any of you that are in the Washington real estate market know this painfully, that there's a 71% price premium for walkable urban places over drivable suburban. And again, this is just the opposite of what it was 25 years ago. Because here's the West End. So the West End, as far as price per square foot of a townhouse or apartment in the West End back in 1976, compared to McLean. Those of you that don't know D.C., McLean's a very high-end suburban neighborhood in Virginia. You'd pay a 25% price premium to move into McLean in 1996. Today, you pay a 50% price premium to be in Foggy Bottom. The lines have crossed. We're seeing this taking place in places like Seattle and of all places, that urban hotbed, Columbus, Ohio. So, long story short is that 15, 20 years ago, we looked at walkable urban development and thought this was a niche market, a cute little niche part of the business. But it's now pretty obvious that walkable urban development is the market. And what we're doing here at GW at the Real Estate Center is to train real estate developers and place managers to deliver this product that is far more complex, far more risky, but can deliver a far more sustainable product, and if we do it right, far more socially equitable product. Thank you.
wide-ranging discussion a little bit later this afternoon, but if we want to take a couple of questions for Chris, who has to leave, if somebody from the audience has a question. Yes, miss.
Yeah, I really like the map that you had showing the favored border and the east-west divide in our region regarding the locations of jobs. This is something that MWCOG or the TPP talk about all the time, because it's a huge regional issue for transportation planning. I think that when you're talking about the study, you should emphasize not just the equity implications of redistributing the spatial pattern of jobs in the region, but also the tremendous implications that will have for congestion.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking that from a travel perspective, from the land development perspective, we might think of that map that you showed as being like the market for land development. But people will travel much further distances than that to reach a job. And when we think about the market for travel, we really think about like people coming from as far as Annapolis to access a job in Northern Virginia, and that being like a typical commute for our region. What do you think the implications of how far people are willing to travel for jobs are for your walkability hypothesis?
Well, we've known that the distance people feel comfortable commuting, whether it be by car, walking, transit, is roughly 25 to 30 minutes each way. That's pretty much the average, has been for many, many decades. And yes, we do have those marathon commuters that will be, I mean, I know a lot of folks that live in Fredericksburg and Frederick, on the two sides of the region, up in southern Pennsylvania, that are driving down here. It's mad. But they do it for, they want that semi-rural existence. And you know, of course, that we have this policy in this country as far as affordable housing. The policy is not the low-income housing tax policy. It's not the, our public housing policy. It's drive until you qualify is our affordable housing strategy. That if you just drive another 10, 20 miles, you'll find something that you can afford. And then, of course, you're going to be putting all your money into the cars. You'll be away from your family. You'll be polluting. But that's been our policy. One of the things that we think is crucial, and what we're focusing here, and John and I are working on this to begin to craft a strategy for Foggy Bottom. And the possibility, and we're working with the World Bank and working with GSA and with the Watergate and obviously GW and working with the neighbors to look at this as a place. And to me, the ideal thing is that A, we would put in better infrastructure as far as transportation, such as the new streetcar that's coming. We need a new entrance into the metro station. But the real issue is, can we provide an affordable housing program that for anybody, I mean, and this is sort of my goal. I don't know how realistic it is. Once we push the numbers, we'll find out. But my goal is that anybody who works in Foggy Bottom, if they so choose to live here, could live in Foggy Bottom. And there are mechanisms by which to achieve that. Now, they won't get a single-family home because there's no single-family homes here. But if you want to live in any of these walkable urban places, our goal should be that the people who live there should have the option. And as far as your transportation demand modeling, you're going to have to throw the book out the window if we can, in fact, achieve that. Yes?
This is another question that may be a little off track here, but you're watching so many trends. I'm really curious to talk to someone who's got a feel for why is it that we use housing starts as one of our major national indicators for our economic health?
Because we can measure it. There's an old joke in social science that there was a drunk that came out of a house, and right at the front door he lost his keys, and he stumbled down to the curb and was looking for it under the street light. And his friend came up and said, "So why are you looking here? You lost him by the front door." And he said, "Well, this is where the light is." So we have data. And this is particularly the case, for instance, the whole debate about, the suburbs versus the city. It's a stupid debate. Makes no sense at all. Since we're urbanizing the suburbs and redeveloping the city, there is no suburban city divide anymore. We're all in this together, yet the census has always differentiated between center city and non-center city. So those kinds of issues are that we in social science have miserable data sets, and we end up grabbing on, we look for the keys under the light.
Okay.
Yes?
Last question, Tony.
Chris, why DC? You said at the outset that DC could be the exemplary metro area in the country where these changes are occurring. Now, DC is quite unique in terms of its economic base, given the government and so on. So, also having read the paper that you had of mine, the walk-ups, I was really wanting to ask you, how do you see DC as the exemplary place for this transformation?
Right. Obviously, people, and particularly outside of DC, look at that rather skeptically. Every metropolitan area has export industries by which it makes its living. Seattle, it's Boeing and software and the port. Detroit is obviously still automobiles. DC just happens to be the federal government. Now, it's much less reliant upon the federal government, but you can't kid yourself. The federal government drives this economy. Just like the car industry drives Detroit. Just like Boeing and Microsoft drive Seattle. So every metropolitan area has an export sector. And you live and die based upon those export businesses and organizations. So the fact that we happen to have the federal government here is not consequential at all. It's just our export earner. And so then people say, well, yeah, but the feds are just, they don't have cycles. Well, A, we do have cycles as we're learning, as we're cutting back spending. Yes, we do have cycles. But B, 20 years ago, DC was not leading the trend. DC was a drivable suburban Sunbelt city with miserable traffic and sprawl that was unmitigated, like Atlanta, like Dallas. And this will demonstrate, since Tony, you're now just teaching here at GW, this will really impress you with the diligence of the research we do here at GW. I've done the work. The federal government was in Washington 20 years ago, and we were sprawling. So it has nothing to do with the federal government. That just happens to be how we make our living. But the proactive reason why it's DC, I think, and I can't prove this, this is just correlation, this is not causality, is that Metro DC is the most highly educated workforce in the country, head and shoulders above any other metro area. The next 5 metro areas, as far as college education above age 25, are, and this is not in order, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Denver, and Boston. Those are also the next 5 most walkable urban places in the country. So again, correlation, I can't prove it yet, but I think it's a reflection of the knowledge economy, which is, I think, what's driving this trend. So.
Thank you, Chris.
Good.
And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jan Bruckner from UC Irvine, Department of Economics. A lot of our students are here, and you all know Dr. Bruckner's work very well. So very happy to have you. You can just advance from there.
So do what?
I think you can go. Yeah.
Okay.
This key here is the advance.
Is there a is there a
laser?
Is there a laser? Oops, I screwed something up here. Sorry.
It's okay.
Doesn't look like it. Why don't you go back to where we were here?
Let's see. Sorry about that.
So there's no laser.
There's a thing there, but it doesn't look like there's a laser. This is the, okay, hold it this
Yeah,
way,
yeah.
and that's the advance.
Okay. All right, so as they used to say on Monty Python,
And now for something completely different. So this is the subject here is more kind of linked to the the slide, urban planning and economics. This is what I want to talk about. And I want to sort of motivate the discussion using a particular example based on some of my recent research. So restricting or regulating land use, that's a lot of what urban planning is about. Land use restrictions are, one of the main things that planners do, design them and optimize them from their point of view and so on. Now, what urban economics is good for, among other things, is to help predict what the effects of these land use restrictions are. Okay? And one of the things that economics is good for, in fact, I think one of the main things that economics is good for, economic analysis is good for, and I always tell my undergraduate students this, is the notion of no free lunch. Okay? So policymakers often think, well, let's impose policy X because there's something we don't like about the way the market works, and so we're going to get rid of that thing by imposing policy X. The trouble is that policy X usually generates unintended consequence Y that is not anticipated in the decision to impose the policy. So in a sense, there's no free lunch because you think you can fix the problem with X, but in fact you created some other problem, Y, in doing so. And one of the things that economics is good for is finding identifying these problems, namely, is pointing out exactly the way in which the free lunch is not available because of unintended consequences. Okay? So, so what I'd like to do today is tell you about building height limits or floor area ratio restrictions. So this is a really common regulation that planners impose all around the world. Okay. So what's a floor area ratio? Well, it's the area inside a building divided by the lot size. Okay. Now, if a building covered the entire lot, the floor area ratio basically tells you how many stories there are in the building, right? If the building covers less than the lot area, then the floor area ratio is going to be bigger than the number of stories. Okay? So now, floor area ratio regulations, exist all around the world. Now the question is, are these regulations actually constraints on anybody's behavior? Well, it depends. In some cases, and the planners here would know better than me about this, in some places what FAR regulations do is they basically validate the decisions of the market. In other words, builders want to build a 20-story building in a place, that's what the housing market dictates. Then the planner says, okay, the FAR limit in this spot is 20. So it's just basically whatever people want to do. Okay? But now there are other situations in which FAR limits are clearly a constraint on land use. Okay? And of course, one of the world's best examples is right here in Washington, D.C. And so, and the argument is you've got a city full of monuments and beautiful government buildings. You don't want them in the shadow of high-rises. You don't want some gigantic high-rise next to the U.S. Capitol. And so, I'm just reading a story in the Wall Street Journal about this. I guess that the limit is 160 feet in Washington. And evidently that's the height of the U.S. Capitol. Anyway, the thing is connected to the U.S. Capitol. And evidently Washington is thinking of relaxing its FAR limit a little bit to allow denser, more intensive land use. So Washington is one of the best examples of FAR limits. And another city is Paris, where you can't build tall buildings, and almost all the tall buildings in Paris are out on the edge, right? There are a few ones in the middle that got there by accident, basically.
Okay, so, and, you know, floor area limits, or building height limits are nice in a way, right? Washington's a nicer place because of the height limits. Paris is a nice place because of height limits. The character of the city would be totally different without them. But once again, there's no free lunch in height limits. If you're going to do something like impose height limits, then something else is going to happen. And you got to be aware of this something else in deciding whether you want to do height limits, whether you want to impose height limits that really constrain land uses. Now, in a sense, you know, the mathematics of this, if you want to do the urban model, is a little tricky, right? But the intuition is really very simple. Because essentially what height limits do is they reduce the supply of housing, because the amount of housing you can put on the land is lower. The ability of a given land area to supply housing is reduced with height limits. Well, we know that if we reduce supply, prices are going to go up. So one of the consequences of height limits in a city is higher housing prices. Okay? Another thing that height limits do, which is also pretty intuitive, is that they create sprawl. They push the edge of the city out, because clearly, if you can't build up, you're gonna build out toward the suburbs. So height limits raise housing prices. They create sprawl. Another thing they do, which is maybe a little less obvious, is that they have an ironic byproduct of raising building heights in some parts of the city. So let's look at this picture here. Here's a picture of the building height as a function of distance from the center of the city, x is distance. So in the normal case, you know, without any height limits, the building height goes down as you go away from the center in the way that we all know about, right? But now suppose that urban planners decide that they want to have a height, that they don't like the tall buildings in the center, and so they impose a height limit at the dotted line in the city. Okay. Well, now the building heights are going to be constrained at that height as long as the height limit is binding. But once the height limit is not binding, then buildings can be whatever they want. But the point is that because you squeeze the central part of the city, the building heights go up out here in the suburbs, where the height limit isn't binding. In other words, height limits go up, they're still not high enough to be constrained by the height limit. So it's like a balloon, you know, you squeeze it here and it bulges out somewhere else. There's another example of the no free lunch principle. Okay? So, height limits are an interesting question. One of the issues here is what you get by imposing height limits worth it? Okay, so keep that in mind. So the research that I've written a couple papers on height limits. One was a sort of pure theoretical paper that was partly motivated by the land use policies in India, and then more recently an empirical paper that I'll be telling you about. So the world's tightest height limits are in India. Let me skip to the next slide and show you these numbers. Here are FAR values in the center cities for various cities around the world. Okay? And Indian cities are in yellow. Well, let's look at the bottom here. We've got Singapore 12 to 25, Tokyo 20. Remember, that's roughly building height, but it's double building height if the lot areas are only half taken up by the buildings. Denver 17, New York 15, LA 13, Hong Kong 12, Chicago, on and on. Paris 3. But look at the three Indian cities of Mumbai, Chennai, and Delhi. Between 1 and 2, with Delhi 3.5 more recently. So look at that. It's unbelievable. Compare the height limits in India to Hong Kong or Singapore or Tokyo. They're just dramatically lower. if you've been to Mumbai, it's clear. You look around and the city is basically a low-rise city. There are these things sticking up here and there, and that's because of the sort of corruption of the system where you can kind of work deals with the planners to get exemptions and to build taller buildings. Okay? Okay, so now, what's going on here? Why are the Indians doing this? Well, it's not entirely clear. Some people think that it's sort of an aesthetic question, that Indian planners have an aversion to high densities. They just don't like them. A different argument is that the planners are worried about the bad infrastructure in Indian cities and worried that if they allow higher heights, they're going to overwhelm the infrastructure, the gas lines and sewers and all this stuff. It's not really clear what the reason is. But so, regardless, what we'd like to try to do is to try. Well, let me say one other thing about the India case. Mumbai is a city that's very much like Hong Kong. Why? Because it's land constrained. It's built on a peninsula, and it's huge. It's a big city with more than 15 million people. Okay? What do we know about Mumbai? Mumbai has some of the highest real estate prices in the world. Well, remember what I said before. Restrict supply, get high prices. Those high prices are directly related to this land use restriction. Okay? So if we didn't have building height restrictions of this draconian nature in Mumbai, the place would look like Hong Kong. Look like another city built under severe land constraints with a large population. Mumbai doesn't look like that. It's because of the land use regulation. Okay? So here's what I was saying before about Hong Kong and then about the quality of life issues on the part of Indian planners and so on. Okay, so here's what I'd like to do. What I want to do is try to figure out what the welfare loss from these height limits. I want to ignore any possible gain from them, but I want to figure out what's the downside of these limits. Can we measure it? Okay. Well, the urban economics has gives us a really simple way to measure the downside. It turns out that according to the theory, we can measure the per household cost of the height limits by simply measuring the increase in the commuting cost from the household living at the edge of the city as a result of the height limits. In other words, remember the height limits create sprawl, so the city spreads out, and that means the person at the edge is going to be commuting farther to the center to get to work. And it's that extra commuting cost that is, in fact, an exact measure of the welfare cost. Now, in fact, the height limits are going to generate effects that are more complicated for the people living near the center, because those guys are going to pay higher housing prices, and they also may commute farther too. So for those guys, there's sort of a mixture of effects. But for the guy at the edge, the only effect is the commute cost, because the house prices are anchored at by the agricultural land rent. So the beauty of this is all we need to do is look at that guy, the edge guy, and we can figure out what the welfare cost of the building height limits are. Now, when we're all done, at least we'll know what the damage is, and then we can say, all right, what are the benefits? And can we measure those of having height limits? Okay. So, and at the end, once we've got the individual household welfare costs, we can add things up to compute the aggregate. So let me show you what the numbers are for India. So here's how we're going to do this. We're going to do something that urban economists have done a lot over the years, which is to figure out what the determinants of urban land areas are. In other words, what's the urban footprint, and how does it relate to the city characteristics? Okay. And so the basic urban model tells you what the connections are, and there are various things that matter. One is income. Actually, I forgot to put the most important thing in there. Income and population as well. So that regression formula should have population in it. So richer cities take up more space, bigger cities take up more space. And cities that are surrounded by highly valued agricultural land take up less space, right? The housing developers compete with agricultural users for land, and if the competition's stiff because the land is really worth a lot in agriculture, that makes for a smaller city. Okay? But the last thing to put into this story is the FAR value, because I've just been arguing that if you have a low FAR, that's going to cause the city to spread out. Okay? So what we're going to do is estimate this equation for Indian cities in a cross-section regression. Okay? We're going to get data for 100 plus Indian cities. We're going to know what their land areas are, what their FAR values are, what their incomes are, what their populations are, and we're going to get a handle on the agricultural rent, although it's imprecise. Okay? And we're going to run the regression. And what kind of coefficient do we expect to get on FAR? Positive or negative? If I raise the FAR value, the allowed FAR value, what happens to the size of the city?
The city gets smaller.
City gets smaller, so it shrinks. So I want a negative beta, okay?
The other way, yeah.
So it is? Yeah, but you have to read a couple lines there. All right, so. Anyway, excellent answer. So beta should be negative, and when we do look at the data, it is negative, okay? So now, so what I want to do is, instead of considering the cost of having the limit, I want to go the other way. I want to say, suppose we relax the limit, because that's what we can do policy-wise. Let's relax the limit and see what the benefits are, okay? And so the benefits are going to be reduced commuting costs for the person at the edge of the city, okay? And so from our empirical estimates, we find that a unit increase in FAR, which in India means going from like 3 to 4, the average is about 3, going from 3 to 4 reduces the land area of an average city, which has about 900,000 people, reduces that land area by 19.25 square kilometers, okay? Which is about a 20% reduction. It's a big reduction, right? So we haven't allowed buildings to be much taller. We just went from 3 to 4, but the land area goes down by a lot, okay? And so what this does is it just, using the area of a circle and relation to radius, this tells us that there's a 1/2 kilometer reduction in commute distance for the person at the edge of the city, the household at the edge of the city. And then if we make a bunch of assumptions about the money value of commute time, in other words, how much you have to shell out, like a bus fare or something to commute, and then the time cost of commuting, we end up with that there's an annual commuting cost saving per household of 525 rupees. Okay? Well, how much is that? What that is about 1% of household income. So on one hand you say, 1%, that's not much. But in my book, that's a huge effect. 1% of your income is a lot, okay, for effective in an economic policy like this. Okay, so 1% of household income. So if we compute the aggregate gain in reduced commuting costs for this average city, we get 106 million rupees as the welfare gain. Okay? Now again, we're sort of on unfamiliar territory here because we don't know, rupee or that, blah blah blah. But if we looked at a city, a U.S. city with a population of about 1 million, and we said, what if there was the same welfare gain in terms of percentage of income? The welfare gain in the U.S. for this kind of regulatory change would be $1 billion for that city. So that's a lot of money. So in other words, we're talking about serious monetary
benefits from loosening land use restrictions in India, from allowing buildings to be taller. Okay? So, as I just said, there's a big downside to these height limits in India. And the question is the downside worth it? Well, don't know. Presumably the planners themselves have some idea whether it's worth it, because maybe they have some notion in their mind that you've got to spend X amount fixing the leaky sewers and everything else in Indian cities if you're going to allow higher building heights. But anyway, at least now we know what the downside is, and you can engage in this calculation. My guess is that the downside is larger than the costs, whatever costs there are of allowing taller building heights. But again, we don't know. Now, you know, the World Bank and other agencies have been constantly on the Indian government trying to get them to relax these land use restrictions. The World Bank says that these restrictions and others are a huge drag on the Indian economy. And so, you know, here are some numbers that suggest that maybe these concerns are well placed. All right, so what's the message for urban planning? Well, it's again the no free lunch message. Here we have an exact measure of the size of this no free lunch effect. And a general rule for urban planners would be, remember, it's a balloon. You squeeze it here, it's going to bulge out there. Don't ignore the bulges. Don't pretend they don't exist. And try to take account of all possible effects of land use interventions before you go doing them. Maybe you can hire some economists to help you figure it out. Or learn some economics in your urban planning program. The last thing is important, and I think that planners need to study more economics. It's a good thing, and you don't need to get a PhD in economics to benefit from this kind of training. Now, Garrett, you're going to plug your book. I don't need to plug that. Everybody knows what's good. Yep. All right, so there you go. Thank you.
Well, here in the Sustainable Urban Planning Program, we've been reading that textbook. What is the name of it?
Lecture.
In Urban Economics. So it generates a lot of questions. Here's the author. Here's your chance.
Yes.
One comment on institutions and then one question about the analytics. On institutions, you're attributing a lot to planners that frequently is coming from the bottom up, meaning population. And so it sounds like there's a lot of sort of a target on planners doing things, and sometimes planners recommend higher densities, and communities and neighborhoods say no way. That's a dynamic that happens all the time out there.
Okay,
so
good
that's
point.
an institution's comment. The question on analytics is your assumption about the height limits assuming that it's residents that go out, but jobs don't?
So or a little bit, this is sort of the theory.
It's assuming a unicentric employment place,
right.
So that if the circle goes out, everybody's got to drive to their job,
no, you're
as
right.
opposed to the jobs also going out.
So I'm guilty of what urban economists do a lot, which is using the monocentric city model.
Okay.
And so, you know, presumably a lot of the lessons would generalize to a more realistic city that has employment subcenters and so on and so forth. You're also right that this is about residential land use, not about business land use. And so you would need a more complete story that includes both types of land uses. But so you're right on those comments. Yeah.
Is there any relationship between height limits and slum rates?
And slum rates? Good question. I don't know. You wonder?
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that's interesting about height limits is what they do is they, in some ways, they tend to reduce land values, right? That's one effect, because if you can't develop the land optimally, you're not going to pay as much for it. But there's a countervailing effect on height limits, which is that
overall, height limits raise housing prices. And higher housing prices tend to increase land values. So you've got two different things going on, and it's not clear whether land values go up or down. But the point is that there are profit impacts of height limits. And to the extent that they're not fully capitalized in land values, maybe you have less incentive to develop and and maybe that translates into slum type development or deterioration. But that's a good question. It's not clear what the answer would be actually. Yeah.
Part of the problem is the people that are the decision makers, like the town boards that are making the decisions on you can go this high. Let's say if you're applying for a variance in this particular situation in terms of height restrictions and density, you've got people that are on these town boards that are just clueless as to, they're not looking at the economic side of it. They're looking at, oh, well, if you're replacing that piece of land, that's currently industrial and it has an ugly building or some sort of industrial structure, oh, well, we don't want the buildings to be above what currently exists there. It's going to affect the views.
Right.
So.
No, but it's true. I mean, so how you have sort of non-technical people making these judgments, but maybe that's what the urban planners are supposed to do. They're supposed to be there at the side of the table saying, whispering in the ear saying, think about this too.
It's not going to have an environmental negative impact on the property and on the environment surrounding the property. So like, why restrict it? But
also, a view is a perfectly good reason to be in favor of some land use regulation if that's if you're trying to preserve it. So there's nothing wrong with that. Just that you ought to know what the downside is, right? Yeah.
I'm confused about what you studied, so I'm going to ask a follow-up question.
Okay.
Did you study height limits, or did you study the real floor area ratios
that
are actually happening?
Height limits.
So you studied the policy? The
policy, yeah.
But the real actual buildings that are occupying those spaces could have been higher or lower?
Yes. And you can get information about policy, and especially in a place like India, getting information about what's actually on the land is a tall order.
But I think this is a really important point to emphasize for your study, and that this is really valuable. Because generally speaking, I would really question whether real life floor area ratios are actually that connected to the corresponding regulation. I mean, take any example. I think like in DC, people get variances for things all the time, although the height limit is probably not one of them, but they get variances for lots of things. Setbacks and things like that end up changing the floor area ratio. And,
but I mean, I look out the airplane window in DC and I don't see any skyscrapers next to, next to the Smithsonian Institute. Right?
Yeah, I mean, so clearly there's some kind of limit here, but you can also look all over DC and see places where the land isn't developed up to the limit.
Right.
Right. Like if it was just regulation that was controlling floor area ratios, then I would expect to see buildings that were absolutely the maximum tall that they could be everywhere. And actually, like DC and Paris both are underdeveloped in lots of places.
Right, that's true. So in other words, one of the questions is, does FAR follow the market? If it does, then it's not really a constraint on anybody. It just sort of, matches what people want to do anyway, right? Now, the second question is whether there's violations of these rules. And maybe in a place like India where there's a lot of corruption, maybe you expect lots of violations. And if you go to Mumbai, maybe that's part of the story. There's little things, like I said, things sticking up here and there, and you wonder, where did those come from? But so you're right. All we're doing is looking at the laws, not at the actuality, which is basically impossible.
Well, and I think it speaks to this really interesting interaction between, like, you can say, like, okay, planners should study more economics because, I think your data does speak for itself in terms of you looked at a planning regulation and the economic outcome, but also economists should study more planning and look at how policy is actually translated into reality.
I mean, a rap against economists is we've got all these, ideas and we don't know enough about reality, right?
It's a history.
I'll grant that, okay? Knowing more about reality can never be a bad thing. Yes.
It does seem to me that there's a value assumption that's in here, and that is that we're talking about maximizing the value of land. $1 billion, maybe we want them spending money on community. to maintain the transit system. Maybe that's where the money is going and should be going.
Well,
it's a challenging kind of notion to think about, and I don't know how to.
But why? What's the transit system for, though? What do you mean to maintain the transit system? If you said to me, we want to spend $1 billion to keep light and open and non-dense character to the urban center, I could say, yeah, maybe that's right. But I don't think that was a necessary. You see what I'm saying?
I do.
I mean, why?
Yeah.
Transit system is only as good as what it's used for, right?
Right. I guess I'm thinking of the Port Staff who's spending that $1 billion, and he's going to get that. He's going to take it anyway. So where should his dollars go? Should they be used to support the higher values, property values of development, denser development downtown, or should they be used to support light and air and the transit system? I would argue.
Right. But urban economics can't tell you whether it's worth $1 billion to have more light and less density downtown on an aesthetic basis. It's just a judgment that somebody has to make. Yeah.
Now, you say that in some places there's a limit to how high you can go.
Yeah.
And in that case, you have to expand this way. Now, what if you were to go down as opposed to up?
That's interesting. I don't know. So in other words, cities with height limits have lots of basements and multiple layers underground. I suppose that's possible. Interesting idea.
Yeah, well, I read that they're exploring the ideas of underground cities in popular science.
Sounds awful. I wouldn't deal with it. Yeah.
Jen, you can fix that excess commuting thing with the growth boundary.
More regulations, absolutely. That's what I learned from this talk.
Yeah, but you're still going to have higher housing prices.
I was just trying to set you up.
Garrett and I, by the way, have argued for years about these kinds of things.
I think the really radical idea is that all planners are doing is dealing with system with symptoms. That's all we're doing. We're dealing with symptoms. The underlying economics is causing all of these other things.
No,
so we're trying to figure out how do we deal with those symptoms, and it's helpful to have the economics to try to understand.
Right, I agree 100%. Okay. All right, thanks.
Thank you.